All right, today we're going to do the final topic in Unit 4. It is 4.7, the loanable funds market. It's the final graph for Unit 4. It is typically embedded in many different FRQs as like a 1-point thing, which I'll show you some examples at the end. So my question for you is a real interest rate of 50% good or bad? And I want you to remember that real equals nominal minus inflation. So when we're looking at a real interest rate, it would be what the banks charge us, which is our nominal, minus what they expect inflation to be. So think about that for a second. And hopefully you came up with the answer that this is actually a trick question, because if you're borrowing, a real interest rate of 50% is terrible. If you're lending or investing money into some sort of high yield savings or certificate of deposit, something that's going to yield you a lot of money like the bond market, then 50% would be great. So that's what we have to remember when we're thinking about loanable funds is interest rates hurt borrowers, but they really help lenders. So this is what the loanable funds market looks like. And honestly, it looks like a regular supply and demand graph, but we got some major differences here. So difference number one is that our y-axis is real interest rates, not nominal interest rates. In the money market graph, remember money market looks like this, money supply, money demanded. This is nominal interest rates. That was beautiful. This one is real interest rates, so nominal minus inflation. Over here is quantity of loanable funds, which is nice and easy to remember. Supply of loanable funds and demand for loanable funds. Where they intersect is equilibrium, and that determines the real interest rate and the quantity of loanable funds available. So pretty cut and dry and simple, except supply and demand mean some different things, and we're going to go over those. So let's first look at just the demand curve right here, and you have some blanks to fill out about the demand curve right here. So when I'm looking at just the demand curve, the higher the interest rate, let's say interest rate's up here, the lower the quantity of loanable funds that would be demanded, right? If there's an interest rate of 50%, ain't nobody going to take out any funds. So the demand for loans, the demand for loanable funds is not very high. So an inverse relationship between real interest rates and quantity of loanable funds demanded. If the real interest rate was very low, let's say like 2% down here, then the quantity of loanable funds demanded would be higher. People are more likely to take out a loan for big ticket items for interest sensitive spending like cars and houses if the real interest rate is lower, okay? So demand makes up mostly borrowers, and we're going to talk about who is in that demand curve because it's not just regular people like you and me. It's also businesses and sometimes the government. But the demand curve is made up of borrowers. There's an inverse relationship between real interest rates and the quantity of loans or loanable funds demanded, okay? Now let's just take a look at supply. The supply curve has a direct relationship, meaning not flip-flop. The higher the real interest rate, the higher that lenders are more likely to loan out loanable funds, right? If there's an interest rate of 50%, they're going to be like, heck yeah, we'll supply funds for you to take a loan out for because they'd be making the big bucks. If the interest rate was down here at like 2%, then the lenders would be a little bit less likely to loan out as many loanable funds, to supply as many loanable funds because they won't be making that large return. So that's what I mean by direct relationship. And the supply curve, we'll get to it here in a minute, is mostly lenders of money, okay? All right, so here's where I'm talking about like what is in each curve, and I'm going to get even more specific here in a second. The supply of loanable funds is basically dependent on you and me putting our money in a bank. It's dependent on the amount of people saving money in the country. If we save more money in a bank, we take our money, we put it in a checking deposit or a savings deposit in the bank, then all of a sudden the bank has a large supply of loanable funds, more money to lend out. And I mean, that we could tie this into a number of different things in our free response. We could say that the supply of loanable funds increases, and then there's a reserve requirement, and then we multiply by the money multiplier, and we maximize money supply. I mean, we can tie this into a lot of different things, but it is all hinging on people saving money in banks. And that gives banks money to then loan out. That's the supply of loanable funds. Who is demanding loanable funds? This is made up of any entity that wants to borrow money. So it could be you and me. We borrow money to buy cars and houses, pay off our medical bills, just like interest-sensitive items, interest-sensitive spending. Businesses borrow money for investment spending. But remember, that word investment doesn't mean stocks and bonds. That word investment means capital goods. So I'm going to write that in there, and you should too. Businesses borrow money to build new factories, to buy robots, to buy new industrial equipment, industrial sewing machines, giant mixers in like food factories and things like that. So they are the ones demanding or not demanding loans, loanable funds. The government also demands loanable funds, right? Sometimes the government spends money that it doesn't have. Where does it get that money? It gets it from banks. It gets it from lenders. It gets it from borrowing from technically foreign nations and its own citizens. And so we're going to see the government show up on this graph too. So when you think of supply, think of the savers, think of the banks lending out. When you think of demand, think of the borrowers, which is also like us, but also the government. Okay. So now we're going to get like super specific, and this is the part that I hate, but it's in the AP curriculum, so we got to learn it, right? So let's take a look at supply. When I say that savers make up the supply curve, here is what I mean. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. The bank has to have money in the bank in order to loan out funds. So the supply of loanable funds is dependent on people putting their money in the bank. Who's putting their money in the bank? This first one, private savings, means the amount that households save instead of consume. Private savings is you and me. It's regular people putting our money in the bank instead of consuming. Remember the marginal propensity to consume, and the marginal propensity to save? Loanable funds is really dependent upon this one, that we, instead of spending our money and increasing aggregate demand and that sort of thing, we would take our money in a bank, and that would increase supply of loanable funds. We'll get there in a minute. The government also saves its money. The amount that the government saves instead of spends, which is very minimal, ends up in banks. And so that impacts the supply of loanable funds. So sometimes you might see the word national savings on the AP exam, probably in multiple choice. National savings means exactly what I just said. Regular people plus the government saving money in a bank instead of spending it. The word public means like government. The word private means regular people and regular businesses. So businesses and people saving their money in a bank equals national savings. Okay. Let's move on to demand. So the demand curve, again, we said was downward sloping. It's people who are demanding a loan. They are borrowers. Okay. So, when we're looking at who is borrowing money, it's the same as who is saving money. Private investments, that's you and me, borrowing money, demanding loanable funds. I like to think about like someone going to a bank and saying, you must let me take out a loan. That's demand for loanable funds, okay? It's you and me demanding a loan for interest-sensitive spending like cars and houses and home renovations and, like my kitchen cabinets and things that we can't afford outright, so we borrow money for. It's also businesses buying interest-sensitive goods like machinery, building new factories, that sort of thing. Government borrowing is essentially deficit spending. So we've looked at this word deficit before, but deficit essentially means that the government spends more than what it brought in revenue. So if they're spending more than what they made in tax dollars, they're borrowing that money from somewhere. They're probably borrowing it from individual citizens, from foreign investors. So the government is borrowing money. So the government shows up and people show up in both the supply and the demand curve. So let's move forward. Did I have this on here twice? Yes, I sure did. Hold on. Something got messed up. There is one slide that didn't make it, and I apologize for that. I will try my best to explain it, and if I do a crap job, then we'll figure it out here in a minute. One of the things that goes into supply, where did it go? Oh, I'm so angry at myself. Shoot. Okay, let me backtrack. One of the things that goes into supply, I'm just going to tell you, it's in your notes packet, is foreign investment. Foreign investment is basically foreign investors put their money into our financial system. Just like we joke about in class, like if you want to get around the rules, then put your money in an offshore bank. Other people are doing that as well, and they're investing in our banking system by putting their dollars in our banks. So when they put their dollars in our banks, that impacts our supply of loanable funds. So if we have a lot of, it's called capital inflow. I'm so sorry the slide isn't here. I'll try and post a picture of it or something. I'm an idiot. Capital inflow basically means that there's a lot of foreign money coming into the United States. And just like we said, all money ends up in banks. Like all drains lead to the ocean, all money ends up in banks. So when foreign money gets put into the U.S. system by foreign investors or foreign people opening a bank account, it really increases and impacts our supply of loanable funds. Capital outflow would be foreign investors taking their money out of the U.S. financial system, and that impacts supply of loanable funds as well. So we have net capital flow, net capital inflow. It's basically like how much foreign investment is coming in minus how much foreign investment is going out, and we don't want that to be a negative number because that would really impact supply of loanable funds. A lot of the investment in America is from foreign companies and foreign individuals, and their money ends up in banks just like ours, and thus impacts supply of loanable funds. Okay, I'm so sorry I super messed that up. So here's some shifter examples, things that you might see in multiple choice. If there is changes in borrowing by consumers, for example, if it says American consumers stop taking out loans, that's going to decrease the demand for loanable funds. If there's changes in borrowing by businesses, if it says businesses get a tax cut on their loans, or get a tax cut and they, I don't know, there's some incentive for them to borrow. I'm trying to make up crap, it's not working. There's some incentive for them to borrow, then demand for loanable funds will go up due to businesses borrowing. And then also the government, this is tricky. This one technically can also be supply. We're going to do it here in a second. So changes in borrowing by the government, if the government borrows more money or borrows less money. Supply of loanable funds can be changed if we change private savings. If our marginal propensity to consume majorly increases and Americans save no money, then the supply of loanable funds is going to go down because their money is not being saved in a bank. Changes in public savings, that would be the government saving more or less money. So if the government is deficit spending, then they are not saving money and the supply of loanable funds is going to go down, right? And then finally, the one that I forgot, the changes in foreign investment. If inflow of financial foreign capital comes in, then we have more supply of loanable funds. If foreign investors rip all their money out of U.S. banks, then we would have a decrease in supply of loanable funds. So this is a very likely question that you will see on an FRQ. The FRQ would say something like the government increases government spending and the government increases government spending while also increasing transfer payments and cutting taxes. So we're impacting aggregate demand here. And then we have to think through that scenario. What did I just say? The government increases its own spending, increases government spending, but decreases taxes. That's called expansionary fiscal policy. but they are bringing in less money and spending more money. Where are they getting that money from? That is called deficit spending. So like later on in the FRQ, it might say something like, show what happens to the loanable funds when the government increases deficit spending. Technically, there's two right answers. I'm going to show you both correct answers, and then I'm going to tell you which one you should actually do. So if the government decides to deficit spend more money than what they brought in taxes, they are technically demanding loanable funds. They don't have the money, they have to borrow it from somewhere. So we would increase demand of loanable funds. So I'd say demand for loanable funds, that was terrible. 2, with an arrow, find my new equilibrium, R2, Q2, arrow, you see my sloppiness, but you basically get the deal. Real interest rates will increase, okay? Meaning interest rates for both borrowers and for savers are going to go up. It's more expensive to get a loan, but also if you have your money in some sort of account where you accrue interest, then real interest rates have gone up and you will benefit from that. So that's answer option number 1 and not my favorite. Answer option number 2 for the government deficit spending will end up being a similar situation. If the government is deficit spending, the government supplies a lot of money into our banks. If they're supplying a lot of money into our banks and all of a sudden they're emptying their bank accounts, spending all this money for government spending, supply of loanable funds is going to decrease massively because the government is pulling out all of their public savings in the bank. So that is going to move our real interest rates up. Let me fill in all these arrows. Oop, I'm missing one right here. And you see how we get the same effect? Real interest rates are going to increase, meaning real interest rates for both borrowers and savers is going to increase. This is an interesting phenomenon we're actually going to cover next unit. I want to say it's like topic 5.5 called crowding out. Basically, the government had good intentions, right? They were like, let's save the economy out of a recession. So they increased government spending and they decreased taxes. Okay, they had this grand idea that that was going to increase consumer and investment spending and increase aggregate demand and woohoo, everything's going to be fixed and decrease unemployment. But it actually ends up hurting investors, and here's why. When they deficit spend, when they spend funds they don't have, regardless of which way you swing it, either they're demanding loanable funds or they're decreasing the supply of loanable funds because they're emptying out their government accounts and there's not as much money in the financial system. Either way you swing it, you get this real interest rates going up issue. And if real interest rates go up, you are crowding out. You're pushing out business investment. You're pushing out private investment because the government is unintentionally pushing out those investors, not investment, what's a better word? People aren't going to take out loans because real interest rates are rising. So in that way, they were trying to fix this economic issue, but they actually maybe made it worse because of that rising interest rate. People aren't going to buy cars and houses and do home renovations, and people aren't going to, factories aren't going to buy new robots and new technology because real interest rates are rising. So it's like this fiscal policy disaster where it actually had an opposite effect. It's called crowding out. We'll talk about it next unit, but that's like a little introduction. So let me show you what you might see on an FRQ. This one's from 2010. Pause the screen for me, read through all of it. Okay, welcome back. Notice the only thing that's new when it comes to loanable funds is D and E. So it basically says, to finance the increase in government spending on national defense from Part B, the government borrows funds from the public. Using a correctly labeled graph of loanable funds show the effect of the government borrowing. So you have to point 1, correctly label. So that would be 1 point. You then need to either, this is deficit spending, increase demand or decrease supply of loanable funds. That would be 1 point. And you have to show that real interest rate goes up. and that would be 1 point as well. So that's an example of how you might see it on an FRQ. And then Part E is dependent on you getting Part D right. Part E says, given the change in the real interest rate in Part D, which we decided real interest rate's going to rise no matter what is the impact on investment? Investment's going to decrease because people aren't going to take out loans. Businesses aren't going to take out loans if interest rates have crept up. And the economic growth rate will slow down as well, because if investment spending in aggregate demand goes down, then economic growth will go down as well. So that is an example of loanable funds showing up in an FRQ. I think I have one. Oh my gosh, who am I? I think I have one more. There's one more. This is an older one, but this is a short FRQ, so you'd be given about 15 minutes for this one. Pause the screen and read through it real quick, and then we'll talk about how you could answer this. All right, so Part A, assume that businesses are granted a tax credit on spending for machinery. Oh, so businesses are incentivized to spend on machinery, but they might not be able to afford that machinery. So what are they going to do? They're going to take out a loan. Demand for loanable funds is going to go up. Using a correctly labeled graph of the loanable funds market, show the effect of the business sector's response on real interest rate. So on this one, you would get 1 point for a graph, correctly labeled, 1 point for increasing the demand for loanable funds, and you get 1 point for showing that real interest rate will actually increase, okay? B is so rude. It tells you to do another loanable funds. Assume instead that the tax rate on interest income from household savings is lowered. There's no change in government budget deficit. Using a second correctly labeled graph of loanable funds, show the effect of the household's response on the real interest rate. So again, you're going to get a point for the graph, a point for shifting it the correct way, and a point for saying what happens to real interest rate. And then it relates it back to production possibilities curve in Part C. It came back to haunt us. So this is an example of a short FRQ that is loanable funds dependent. You are much more likely to see a long FRQ like this, where the last part, maybe 2 parts, is about loanable funds. All right, sorry this lasted a lot longer than I thought. Bye.